People love betting on things. Look at what the legalization of sports betting has done to the average fan. Anyone with an internet connection or maybe a VPN, depending on where they live, can turn into the guy from Uncut Gems in just a few clicks. DraftKings and FanDuel sponsorships are everywhere. Sports broadcasts now regularly update you on betting lines, and it's so addicting, even the players are getting in on it. NBA player Jontay Porter was recently accused of potentially pulling himself out of games so that people could bet on his unders. Or basically, people would bet that he wouldn't score a certain number of points or get a certain number of rebounds. He just got a lifetime suspension from the NBA because leagues do not play around with players gambling. ESPN talking heads are telling us how bad a guy like Jontay Porter is for sports, but of course it doesn't hit the same when they're doing it on a network with a $2 billion partnership with the gambling company Penn. It's not just a basketball thing. NFL player Calvin Ridley was suspended for a year after being caught betting $1,500 through a gambling app. In the MLB, there's the Shohei Ohtani story, where the Japanese player's interpreter, Ippei Mizuhara, has admitted to stealing at least $16 million of Ohtani's money and using it to bet on sports. He's now facing like 30 years in prison. So with everybody seeing how hot the gambling industry is, it's no wonder that music companies are starting to get involved. This month, Billboard announced a new app called the Billboard Hot 100 Challenge. Predict the hits. Every day, the app shows you a new song and asks you to guess what its peak position on the Billboard charts is going to be. The game runs in seasons, and this season will run up to July 16th. The person with the most accurate guesses will win $25,000. The second place winner will get VIP access for two to a 2024 or 2025 Billboard event, and the third place winner will receive 2 concert tickets to a show in their area. I wonder if they get to pick or like they just get sent to like a random show. Like they're gonna end up at a DaBaby show. Anyone who is generally skeptical of the music industry may have had a negative reaction to the news. Your brain can race through all the ways that something like this might suck. My first thought was that people could be stat botting and stream farming songs so that they can win this competition, but honestly, the prizes just aren't big enough for people to be doing that, in my opinion. Playing around with the app 2 days in showed 2 songs that could be guessed on: Doja Cat's Mask with Tizo Touchdown and Artemis's I Like the Way You Kiss Me. There's an interesting question here about how they pick which songs they put in this app. Doja Cat is signed to RCA, and according to Artemis's agency page, he's signed to 10K Projects, which is an indie label, but it's founded by Elliot Grange, the son of Lucian Grange, who is the CEO of Universal Music Group. So it's not like that's like some basement operation here. You know what is a basement operation? This YouTube channel. Well, not really. I'm actually on the 2nd floor, but whatever. You guys have been so supportive, getting me over 2,000 subs in like under 6 months. Like, I cannot thank you guys enough. Every like and subscribe really means so much to me. I post a video about music every week. If you want to see those videos early, go follow me on Instagram, HADJI Gaviota. Go to my broadcast channel. In that broadcast channel, I post all the videos 1 day early. Thanks for the love on my new song, Kick It Like We Used To. New song next month, probably. Pretty sure. Stay tuned. All right, back to the video. I think the initial fear that I had about the integrity of the app is a little bit unfounded. But of course, the real scary thing is that it's a sign of what's to come. Gambling and music will become further and further entangled with each other. And with those two things comes corruption. We've already seen it in sports. I'm not saying I don't support the legalization of gambling or anything like that. I generally think people should just do whatever they want. I don't know how strong of an opinion I really have on it. I like laughing at parlay memes on Twitter. I have some friends who make money off of it, and I'm happy for them. I'm a man with plenty of vices. I just don't know if gambling is one of those, for me, yet. My problem with this app is it's yet another example of how obsessed music fans have become with sales and charts. Logging onto Twitter, you'll see fan bases giving out detailed guides on how to get their favorite artists to hit #1. Buying multiple copies of an album, buying CDs, cassette tapes, and vinyl, even if they don't have like the hardware required to play them, leaving albums streaming overnight, so on and so forth. And it's all in the name of support and getting those numbers up. The fans kind of drive it, but the artists definitely play into it too. In the mid to late 2010s, the bundle culture was crazy. Artists like Travis Scott were selling motorcycle helmets just to get you to buy a copy of their CD so that his first week sales could be higher. Justin Bieber was dropping infographics on how you can get his song Yummy to #1. Spoiler alert, didn't work. When did we get to this point? Was it always like this? The answer is no. I tried to figure out a good place to start in answering that question, so I went on the Beatles Reddit. where somebody had asked already what I would have asked. Did Beatles fans in the past try to make every new single reach #1 on the charts? The Beatles Reddit is crazy because people who legit were out there buying Beatles records in the 1960s are in there commenting. But anyway, the consensus is no, fans weren't really doing that, and the Beatles fans were so crazy that they had a word for it, Beatlemania. And there is a strong correlation between that Beatlemania fan culture and what we see today with K-pop stans and the Barbs and the Swifties. It was just being quantified differently. And it's not that the Billboard charts didn't exist back then. They were just different. The Billboard charts have existed since before recorded music was even the standard, when they were ranking the weekly top sellers in sheet music, as early as 1913. In the 1940s, there were 3 distinct charts. Best sellers in stores, which tracked physical music sales, most played by jockeys, not like the dudes who ride horses, but the guys who were picking what's on the radio, and most played in jukebox, which tracked whatever people would play in public settings when you can go up with a quarter and just throw it into the jukebox and pick whatever song you want. Or if you had whatever word for Riz they were using back then, you probably just punched it or leaned up against it and your song just started playing. I think you needed to have a leather jacket on to unlock that kind of swag. Either way, all 3 of these charts were divided. Well, in the modern times, a bunch of different factors all contribute to the same Hot 100 chart. In the 50s, they expanded those charts to be out of 100, and they called it the Top 100, but in 1958, they ended up renaming it to what it is today, the Hot 100. However, even then, the way that sales were being calculated was totally different. Rather than have an automated service like there is today, Billboard would call the record stores and promoters, and each of those parties would then say how many they sold. And all of those groups had their own way of keeping track of things, organizing things, and ranking them. As you can imagine, this led to a lot of unreliable data. And of course, there were ways for a label to ask these parties to fudge the numbers in whichever direction they wanted them to go. Usually, of course, to make an artist look better. When Billboard partnered with media and data company Nielsen to develop SoundScan in 1991, everything changed. Now sales were being based on the scanned barcodes on the actual physical music product, and not just somebody saying, hey, we sold this many copies. Of course, even after that, the advent of digital music and streaming drastically changed the way we keep track of sales. Almost nobody buys albums, like physical albums, to listen to them anymore. They would buy them as collectibles or simply just to increase the sales of their favorite artist. But for a good 15 years after SoundScan was established, physical CDs were everything. You still had to go into the store and buy that CD to listen to the album. So in this era, in the 90s and the early 2000s, physical media sales were #1, and they were, for the first time ever, reliable in their numbers. Genres that didn't traditionally go #1 before the SoundScan revolution, things like hair metal, were now having their first week moments in the sun. Album sales back then were insane. In 2000, Eminem's The Marshall Mathers LP sold 1.78 million copies in its first week. NSYNC's album No Strings Attached, in the same year, sold over 1 million copies in its first day, and almost 2.5 million copies in the first week. Looking at these sales with the lens of music fandom that we have today, you might guess that they had fan bases that were going crazy trying to get those numbers to the top. And their fan bases were going crazy, but we need to remember that getting that CD was the only way to listen to that album whenever they wanted to. Yes, digital music did exist, especially towards the latter half of the 90s, but the iTunes store didn't exist. So it wasn't super accessible unless you really knew how to use computers. And also, everybody had desktop computers back then. They didn't have phones that could have the music on them, and they didn't even have laptops for the most part. So if you wanted to hear that album in your car, or you had a CD player, you needed that disc. So to put it bluntly, people weren't going and buying albums to try to make their favorite artist go #1, at least not in the same way that we're seeing it today. And if I had to guess where all of that culture started to change, I would guess it was with the great first week competition of 2007. Two of the biggest rappers in the game were in a collision course, both dropping their highly anticipated third albums on the same day. 50 Cent was one of the most commercially dominant rappers of the 2000s. His first album, Get Rich or Die Tryin', sold over 800,000 copies in its first week, and it went on to be the best-selling album of 2003. His second album, The Massacre, in 2005, had the second largest opening week of any hip-hop album in history, only behind the Eminem one that I already mentioned. It sold over 1 million copies in just 4 days. So his third album, Curtis, was next up. The singles were mildly successful. I Get Money, and AO Technology. Both would be pretty big in any other rapper's catalog, but they're certainly not in the club. So in the grand scheme of 50 Cent's career, he wasn't exactly coming into this album on a hot streak. In the other corner of the ring was Kanye West. The story of Kanye West is one that got a 3-part Netflix documentary that still didn't have everything in it. So I'm gonna give you the most abridged version as possible. He began as a producer, getting some beats on legendary rap albums like Jay-Z's The Blueprint, before people finally gave him a chance to rap, which is what he wanted all along. When he finally got his shot, he made it count. His first album, The College Dropout in 2004, did over 400,000 copies in its first week, and it went on to sell 2 million copies by the end of the year. His follow-up, Late Registration in 2005, doubled those first week sales and did 800,000 copies. Today, it's 5 times platinum. Both of those albums were rooted in a soul sample sound with a college aesthetic, but for his third album, Graduation, Kanye had more ambitious ideas. He wanted to make stadium music. The single, Stronger, sampled Daft Punk and was a smash hit. He threw on those shutter glasses and the rest was history. The two had played each other their albums and were in a genuinely friendly competition, but in the public they were hyping it up as a real battle. In a Rolling Stone article from a week before the release, 50 said, "Mine will sell and his will still be on the shelf. He should be terrified. What do? Do I send flowers? Do I send my condolences?" Kanye wasn't quite as trash talky. Instead, he hyped the two of them up together. "What's the point of even having magazines without us? We're the f***ing Jim Morrisons. We're the f***ing Kurt Cobains of this. Yeah, I said it. Listen to the album. I am." Honestly, that's about a 2 out of 10 on the Kanye West brag scale in 2024, but back in 2007, that was probably making headlines. So the fans were engaged, excited that 2 of hip-hop's biggest acts were involved in a friendly competition. I mean, we can imagine what that's like right now in 2024, with 2 of hip-hop's biggest acts being in an unfriendly competition. But that Kanye 50 Cent competition wasn't being judged on something subjective, like who had the better album. Although by all accounts, the better album was Graduation and not Curtis. I think even 50 Cent would tell you that if you gave him a truth serum. But anyway, this was being graded on first week sales. While I'm sure artists themselves cared about sales before this moment, this time the fans were involved. And I think this really set a precedent for fans caring about sales and eventually using it in arguments amongst each other. As for who won, are you surprised? Graduation did almost 1 million first week and Curtis did about 600,000. In 2013, history repeated itself when Kanye was dropping his album Yeezus on the same day as J. Cole's album Born Sinner and Mac Miller's Watching Movies with the Sound Off. J. Cole actually moved his album a week up so that it would specifically drop at the same time, and then he rapped about that on the album. Kanye again outpaced the competition. This time, it was 2 younger upstarts in Cole and Mac than, a competition that was at the same level as him. It was close though. Yeezus sold 327,000 copies in its first week, while Born Sinner did 297,000, and Watching Movies did 102,000, which doesn't sound close, but it's pretty crazy when you remember it was an independent release and not a major label one. These moments have become more and more commonplace in music. I mean, Travis Scott and Nicki Minaj did this in 2018 in the Bundle Off. Fans can't wait to see first week sales to brag about their favorite artists, moving more units, or to shit on the artists they don't like. But let me ask one question that always weighs on my mind when I see this discussion. Who the f cares? I think the argument for caring about sales in favor of that comes down to wanting to support the artist. When those are the parameters, then yeah, it's understandable and fair. Of course, buying copies of your favorite artist's album will help them financially somehow. If they're independent, that's a nice little chunk of change in their pockets. If they're in a label deal, it helps them get closer to getting out of it, maybe getting a new label deal, or finally getting to be independent. Either way, your purchase of their album helps them make the next one that you might enjoy. It's a way of saying thanks for making this art that makes my existence a little bit easier. As a musician myself, it makes me feel warm and fuzzy when people buy my albums on Bandcamp, so I can only imagine how it feels to see 300,000 copies first week next to your album when it comes out. It must feel amazing. With that being said though, ironically, buying an artist's music usually is not the best way to support them financially. Things like touring and merch will put a little more money in their pocket than buying an album would. Of course, those things will also cost more than buying an album. And a lot of artists are broke and they surely wouldn't complain if you bought anything in the first place. But I still feel like I have to point that out. And where this argument really loses me is when an artist's sales become a competition without the artist making it a competition. The insert artist outsold meme is funny on Twitter, but also why does it matter at all? Believe it or not, stuff like this can legitimately make your favorite artist's life worse. Sometimes these discussions can lead to genuine rifts between artists who didn't even have a problem with each other before that. Nicki Minaj and Cardi B, of course, have their own real life issues going on. But if we look at some of the other beefs in the women rap world, it usually takes a full-on guide to understand why they have problems with each other. And along the way, there probably was a lot of instigation from the fan bases. Whether they know it or not, that's what ends up happening. If you genuinely care about these artists, then going under other artists' pages to be like, my favorite artist outsold, is probably not helping your favorite artist's case or making their day easier. The emphasis on sales also makes the product worse, which makes our experience as fans worse. Have you ever wondered why you rarely sit through a full album these days? Your attention span might not be what it used to be. After exposing it to the radioactive muck that is TikTok and short-form vertical media, but still, it's not entirely your fault. A lot of mainstream albums are bloated as these days. And why is that? Because streams count towards sales. So the more songs there are to stream on an album, the more sales are going to come from somebody streaming that album. And artists don't want their first week sales to be embarrassing. So they load their albums up with as much music as humanly possible, which, like, yay, obviously I want more songs from my favorite artist, but it makes the album experience less cohesive. I did a video on this that goes way more in detail than I did here, and I'll put it in the description. But it's gotten to the point where when an artist drops a shorter and more cohesive project, they get applauded for it because it's so out of the ordinary. Jack Harlow did this with his album Jackman, where he clearly was not worried about what the first week's sales would be because it's only 10 songs long and he didn't even do a single for it. That used to be like not a crazy thing to do, but it sure ain't anymore. The need for artists to inflate their sales, well, need is a strong word, but the desire for artists to inflate their sales leads them to do things like what French Montana did on his most latest album, Mac and Cheese 5. I also did a video on this. Not only did he drop over 100 songs across all platforms when you include all the different versions, clean, sped up, slowed down, whatever, but he also sold $5 vinyl pre-orders. Now, as an artist who has made vinyl themselves, vinyl is not a cheap thing to make. He was taking a loss on that. That sounds like really nice fan service. But because the vinyl needed to be shipped on the release date of the album for those sales to count towards the first week's sales, he and his team then shipped the vinyl to a bunch of random addresses. He only did this vinyl thing to increase his sales. And the reason why artists inflate their sales, yes, it's to make money, but it's also because they're worried about the public perception when the sales number comes out and it might not be as high as it was at the peak of their career. And it really worries me from the fan perspective that some people seem to not even enjoy music for the music and just for the stat watching. In sports discussions, people who don't watch the games but try to argue using statistics are called box score watchers. That's a bit of an oversimplification because some sports stats are like honestly really great, but there's a lot you won't be able to appreciate unless you actually watch the game. At the same time, with the way that fan bases argue about sales, it seems like they genuinely might not even care what the music sounds like, just the units it moves. What's the point? You can enjoy an album even if it flops commercially, and you can think an album kind of stinks even if it sells a lot. There's so much by the numbers discourse in music now, and I think a big part of it is the newfound ability for us to have those numbers at our fingertips at all times. It really is an amazing thing to be able to see an itemized list of how much every album ever sold in its first week. It's pretty cool to be alive at this particular point in time. But let's not forget that we're all here because we love music, not because we love numbers. Well, most of us. I'm also a math teacher, so I guess I love numbers too, but I try to leave that in the workplace when I clock out. So the reason why I made this video in response to that Billboard thing is I see a troublesome combination of two things that bother me personally rising on the horizon. One is the constant gamification of everything I love, which is fine. I love gamifying things sometimes. But with the widespread legalization of the gambling industry, it becomes something that's more of a financial thing than an actual game. This Billboard app is not that, but it's a sign that that is coming down the line at some point. Who knows when, but it could be sooner rather than later. The other problem is music discussion moving away from being actually about music and moving towards being about sales and charts. If I wanted to argue about sales and charts, I would be a consultant or a financial analyst. I'd do it on Microsoft Excel, not on Spotify. Games like these, especially with a financial incentive, will only further that agenda. I guess these things aren't morally wrong in a bubble. I just don't really like them, and I'm guessing that I'm not alone in that. So what do you guys think? Am I overreacting to this app? Is arguing about sales and charts actually a fun and fulfilling activity? Am I just a grumpy old loser? Let me know in the comments. Peace.